Hey guys, long time no see. This is episode 5 of the Swordfighting Bible, and today, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go over the last of the concepts that we introduced in episode 2. This video will be slightly longer than the others, but I assure you it's for good reasons. There's a lot of stuff to cover, and because of the nature of the content we're covering, there will be less concrete visuals or calculations and more of me talking and discussing stuff. As always, I'm going to assume you've watched the previous episodes in the series, and without further ado, let's get started. Today, we're going to talk about the macro. While the three previous concepts were intended to lay out the foundations of the mechanics and explain how to play, the point of the macro is to go over the strategy aspect of the game. So, for example, you might know how to build a big combo, but knowing when you should build a big combo or instead go for a smaller combo, that's essentially what macro is all about. I'm going to go over 4 general points that I think lay out the foundation of the macro in sword fighting. It is a little misleading to split the macro into 4 categories, as in reality they heavily overlap and affect each other in some ways, as we'll notice in a second, but for the sake of simplicity for now at least we'll treat them as separate. Also, make sure to keep in mind there are often situations where there is no clear answer. You'll be put into a spot during the mid-game where you have to decide which path to take, and sometimes it will be a coin flip on which path was the right one. But also, there are a lot of wrong paths to take, and hopefully we'll address some of those in this video. Anyway, hopefully I'll be able to clear this up with some examples in just a moment, but let's start for now. Point number 1. Sword matchup. First thing you should look for as you enter a sword fight in any game is to look at your opponent's sword. This matters a lot. Most people think it's only crucial during the mid game, but trust me, it can matter for the early game as well. Say you're playing Falchion against a Skull Dagger. How should you go about the early game? The Skull Dagger user in general will go for a quick opener, as it cannot trade big openers without getting crushed. Now you might ask, why is this the case? The 3 main reasons is that sprinkles are halved, big hits from the Skull Dagger are cleared much more easily than that of the Falchions, and the fact that a disruptive effect from the Skull Dagger is much more beneficial, because it's more likely to land on an uneven board that will make it harder to clear. Okay, but the point is here that the Skull Dagger user is on average expected to send a smaller attack, generally. So you need to adjust your strategy for your opener a lot in that matchup. Once again, this is just an example, but hopefully it gets the point across. You definitely need to have a good knowledge of swords and their matchups and their different strategies so you can know what to expect. Alright, next up is point number 2, player matchup, aka the skill matchup. This one is the easiest to apply from different games, I would say. This is all about playing in the best way to match your opponent's style. If your opponent is someone who likes to build huge openers and send big attacks in general, you can opt for a disruptive early game followed by a tempo-heavy mid-game and then transition to a defensive build with counterattacks to soak up huge strikes, followed by having your opponent suffocate in his own mess as he slowly digs his own grave. This is one theoretical example, but in reality, enemies won't force this one-dimensional approach. I think that sword fighting is a game which can't be truly solved by humans. There's a million factors that would be impossible to keep in mind as you play. Theoretically, you could create a bot or some sort of advanced AI that would play perfectly by keeping track of every single possible enemy board state, giving the enemies gray screen, and then come up with a perfect move to counter it. Realistically, though, sword fighting ultimately is a game where human nature is a huge factor. Just like in poker, reading your opponent and reacting accordingly while playing fast and well is really hard, which is exactly why it's so difficult to make a general guide for the macro. As I said earlier, the right answer to almost any macro question is it depends. Next up is point number 3, and that's board states. This is, in my opinion, the most important one. It might seem as common sense to some people, but it's something even I have trouble with sometimes. The most important macro information you can gather is by paying attention to not only your board state, but your opponent's board state. By board state, I mean the state of your board. No, but seriously, as in, is your board clean right now? Does it have defensive blocks? Is it ready for counterattacks? How many breakers do you have? Is it completely messed up and you will die, even if you get several lucky breakers in a row? Step 1 is knowing your own board, which most of you will think, yeah, that's pretty simple, but Here's step two, which is very difficult, knowing your opponent's board. How is that possible, you might think? Well, the gray mini screen gives you a lot of information, more than you might think. Now, this is a very hard skill, and you won't learn this overnight. I remember when I first started playing League of Legends, the biggest hurdle of mine was learning to pay attention to the minimap, outer lanes, and the enemy jungler. Now, I still suck at that, but mostly because I don't play enough. But besides the point, it's the exact same for sword fighting. Not only must you focus on your sword fighting, your gameplay, but you need to pay attention to the enemy board state. Obviously, knowing your opponent's board state with 100% certainty is impossible unless his board is empty. This is important during the early game, as it might give you insight to what kind of build the enemy is going for. For example, is your opponent going for a side build, or an upside down build, or is he just stacking his breakers in column 4? Things like these are good early on, but in the mid game, how can you possibly know your opponent's board state? Well, there's a few things here. You can pay attention to how many and what types of attacks you've sent. If you're using a falchion and you've only sent sprinkles as an opener, you can expect them to clear it relatively easily. If you hit them hard with 2 big strikes, you can expect their board to be completely messed up. Things get a little bit more interesting though when you start considering defensive boards and defensive blocks. For example, a single 2x2 block can completely block off a huge mid-game combo, which is why I would heavily discourage huge mid-game combos in general, especially with full boards. There's a time and place for everything, and say your board looks like this and someone sends 2x12 strikes. All the hard work to create such a big combo is wasted. Now is a good time to briefly mention counterattacks and a time when they're useful. If you can recognize that your opponent has a defensive board, I would heavily recommend saving big blocks or combos and send it after your opponent clears. Or if you can, set your board up in such a way that when your opponent sends an attack, he sets off your combo. Not always possible, so blocks are a lot easier to work with in that regard because you just need one breaker to clear big blocks. Once again, there's no 100% obvious answer to when you should wait and prepare for a counterattack or when you should try to finish them off. We've spent quite some time on point 3 already, but let me take the time to showcase Cremate, who should be well known to most sword fighters. In his prime, he truly was a master of the defensive build style. Let's take a look at an old video I played of a 4-minute game against him where he just refuses to die. Spoiler alert, I end up losing. Why did I end up losing? Did Cremate get lucky? Well, we can argue about that another time, but the focus here was that I actually misplayed. Recognizing this player matchup, I should have prepared better counterattacks and not just mindlessly built combos and just sent them whenever they were ready or just kept sending the biggest stuff I could, not saving breakers, etc. Now, I apologize that I will not analyze the whole video as it would make this video that much longer than it already is, but I heavily encourage you guys to watch through it for educational purposes and spot my mistakes in macro. I mean, in micro as well, but macro specifically because that's the point here. That was a game that was lost due to poor macro, I think. Now, let's move on to the last point, which is piece queue. This one is heavily correlated with the previous point, but much easier to objectively track, I think. Let's say you're playing stick sword fighting. Point 1. You know for a fact that you're much faster than your opponent. That's point 2. Game drags out and you get a blue breaker. Logically, you know that your opponent will get a blue breaker shortly after you, because the PSQ is shared between the players. So you need to make a big decision here. If you use the blue breaker, you better be sure it kills him. Otherwise, you're risking a counterattack, leaving you with a presumably full board and him with a clean middle. How do you know what the right choice is? Do you try to save the blue breaker, or do you try to finish off your opponent? In this scenario, the answer is it depends. That's not really helpful, I know, right? But the answer really depends. Here's a few things to keep in mind though. If you use your blue breaker, would the attack be enough to cover up your opponent's board? How far ahead are you in the piece queue? As in, how much faster are you than your opponent? Are you just one move ahead of your opponent? Then it would be incredibly stupid to try to attack, as he'd easily counterattack the whole board right after you sent yours and you would waste yours. Are you like 20 moves ahead? There were no blues or green breakers for a while, and your attack would cover up his board, except for, the three pieces. Definitely. Then go ahead. Don't give him time to breathe and just finish him off. Now, you don't always have the choice of this, but, just for this example. Another interesting application of this that I thought I would cover is the part that heavily correlates to the previous point, and is how many breakers are there on the opponent's board. The most common scenario this happens is, say you send a quick medium-sized opener, but your opponent has still not sent anything. Now, you should be fearing for your life. It's very possible that your opponent, which we'll assume is good for this example, is trying to dig through your attack in order to access his opener. When he does that, you're screwed. So what are your options then? Well, you have a few options. Either go all out, trying to finish him off and bury him and keep disrupting him, or prepare for the worst. But once again, there's no 100% correct answer because it depends on the enemy's board, which you cannot know with 100% certainty. But let's for a second assume your opponent messes up his opener. He ends up sending several small sprinkles. Now, this is important, so pay attention. Whenever your opponent sends any attack, that's at least one breaker gone. At least one. The more small sprinkles are sent, the less likely your opponent is to send a huge attack. Not always true, because small sprinkles can also imply he's trying to clean up his board and as a result make blocks, which can also be sent as attacks or comboed. But one could prioritize making blocks of bigger size by wasting a few breakers. This has the benefit of making your board more resistant to strike in general, but the downside is it's awful tempo-wise because you're sending single sprinkles, which the enemy can use to benefit or feed whatever he's building. Sending small sprinkles in general is horrible no matter what sword you're using, but it's not always the worst. Sometimes you need to do it to dig out from the mess you've made. And what I just described could be summed up as defensive sword fighting. We already briefly mentioned it throughout the video, but hopefully now it's more clear on exactly what it is. Although this isn't a 100% complete description, it's adequate for now. So defensive sword fighting is essentially all about trying to prepare for what your opponent is going to send. This is very interesting in stick sword fighting, but obviously also very relevant in all other types of sword fighting, where soaking attacks is such a huge deal that you really need to be conscious of that. You should always assume your opponent is skilled enough to know how to do it. Sometimes you just want to put stuff in column 2 or column 3 or column 1 somewhere just to soak strikes or to protect against strikes because you know that swords they crush through pieces depending on how big the strike is. Anyway, but the point here is that if you track how many breakers your opponent sent, you should be able to have a rough idea of what he's working with. How many possibilities does he have, basically? So we've covered the 4 macro points here. We introduced defensive sword fighting, counterattacks. Now let's try to wrap it up, get some sort of conclusion to this episode. So in a real game, you will need to use all the 4 macro points to decide on the best strategy on how to win. Now, it's a lot of thinking and decision making while you're forced to focus on the sword fighting itself. Building blocks, combos, etc. Believe it or not, this is really hard. As the saying goes, learn to crawl before you walk. If you can't perform the micro yet, then go back and focus on that first, get the mechanics down, and then try to include macro in your games once you're comfortable with building combos and building blocks and all that good stuff. I really tried to structure this video and plan it in a logical way, and the best I could come up with is covering the 4 macro points, going over some examples, and hoping that will be enough to provide you with a framework to learn on your own. Because there's an endless amount of examples or situations I could cover, and this is how I decided to go with the video. I was originally planning on including a lot more examples at the end of the video and some sword fighting analysis of mid games, but this episode turned out to be a lot longer than I thought. For this reason, because I love you guys so much, I'll make sure next video will be 5.5, which will essentially be part 2 to this episode, and it's just gonna be me talking over, analyzing some mid games, and going over the macro in detail, more than we did in this video at least. So yeah, but that's it for episode 5, I really hope you enjoyed this one. Make sure to drop a like, comment, all that good stuff, and subscribe for more content. And until next time, I hope you have a good one. See ya.